Proverbs chapter 3, that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time this evening. It's good to see each of you this evening. You'll want to thank Mike for the job that he's done up here, I suppose, helping lead the VBS. We had our VBS at Hera maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there was one particular night where we were singing the Roll the Gospel Chariot along, and I accidentally ran over a sister. And so he did not make that same mistake tonight, and so he's doing a fine job, I think. Proverbs chapter 3. Chris, it would help if you would mark this. Oh, you did. All right. Proverbs chapter 3. We're going to focus in large part on verse 5 tonight as sort of our thesis, but it's really within the larger context of verses 1 through 12. And so what I'd like to do tonight is take a look at verses 1 through 12, take a look at what the writer Solomon is trying to say to us, and then maybe to take a look at 1 or 2 other passages of Scripture before we dismiss here tonight. Before we dive into the text, I want to tell you I learned a lesson over the weekend. And it's a lesson that those of you that are married men can probably relate to. I learned this weekend that I am oftentimes wrong. I have learned this lesson before, but it was in a much more pronounced and slightly more serious than usual way. Those of you that are either friends with me on Facebook or attend our congregation at Hera already know this. But I awoke Saturday, slept in a little bit on Saturday, but I awoke on Saturday and went to my car. We were about to leave, and I had left my wallet in my car overnight on accident. And apparently I had left my doors to my car unlocked, and my wallet was stolen, and I filed a police report, and the investigation's still ongoing. That's not the worst part. The worst part is the fact that my Social Security card was located inside of my wallet when it was stolen, something that, go figure, my wife had told me constantly not to do. I learned that my ways are often wrong. My ways are often incorrect. And I think that's the case for each of us. We sometimes realize that when we go through something, maybe we go through some sort of situation, some sort of event, maybe some sort of tragedy from time to time, that our ways aren't always right, that we're not always as smart as we think we are. That's what we're going to focus on in large part today. If you've cheated and gone ahead on and read verse 5, you'll know it says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding." I'm going to encourage your participation tonight. This class will move a whole lot more quickly, a whole lot more smoothly. If you will participate, it will avoid the awkward silences that inevitably come when I ask questions that are not rhetorical. So as we get started, let's read together verses 1 and 2 of Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs 3, verses 1 and 2. "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you." Now, I'm curious, do we have any different translations of verse 3 or verse 2 there, especially the end of that? Peace they will add unto you, add to you.
For they will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity.
Peace and prosperity. That's a little different. What else? Anything else? Does that mean without fail that if I follow the commandments of the Lord, I'm going to have a long life? That I'm going to have a long and wonderful life? No. No, it doesn't. It certainly doesn't mean that I'm always going to have some sort of material prosperity. We're going to talk about that later on. But I'm not going to always have this long, glorious life. I'm not going to have this. I'll tell you, if living the way that the Lord has instructed me to live means I'm going to be prosperous in this life, I am doing something wrong, right? For length of days and years of life and peace they will add you. And so what is Solomon talking about here? What does he mean when he says, length of days and years of life and peace they will add you? Was he wrong? No.
Following God's word keeps us out of a lot of trouble. A lot of things that could possibly
I often say out at Hera that the Christian life is the only life worth living, and it is indeed worth living. I also say that the Christian life is probably the healthiest life we can live. You think about all of the things that you don't get involved in if you're living as you should. You think of all of the activities that you don't participate in if you live as someone who follows the Lord should. Let's move on. Verses 3 and 4. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Now, there are some people, there are some scholars even, that will take this idea of wearing faithfulness and love, steadfast love, wearing those around your neck. They'll say, well, it's an ornament that displays beauty. And that might be what it appears to be talking about until we understand in the Hebrew mind the source of life, one of the sources of life anyway, one of the things that constituted an entire person's well-being was their neck, more specifically their throat. He's not simply saying here, show these things off. He's saying make love, steadfast love, and faithfulness a part of your entire self. This actually differs quite a bit from other ancient religious systems, which would tell you to make these things a part of yourself when it's politically sensitive. Be politically correct with these things. Maybe it's not just ancient religions that teach that, I suppose. But make these things a part of who you are, a part of what your identity is. Then you will win favor and good understanding, perhaps is another way we could interpret that, in the sight of God and man. By the way, have we seen that phrase before, in the sight of God and man? Does that ring a bell? Christ is growing. Luke 2:52, right? Grew in wisdom and stature before God and man. He's saying, make these things, make these commandments, make this steadfast love and faithfulness he's about to describe to us a part of your entire self. Now let's read our key verses for the night. Verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. These two verses and the next 4 as well describe 3 different things that we ought to be submitting to the Lord, that we ought to humble ourselves, we ought to use to humble ourselves before the Lord. Here at first he's talking about, perhaps we might call it intellectual humility, the acknowledgement that I'm not always right. I don't always know. If we turn back to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, we realize that this is just a recapitulation of the idea there. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And the implication there is, if I want knowledge, if I want wisdom, if I want instruction, I seek it out from the Lord. I don't seek it out from myself. By the way, I know the word wisdom isn't used in our text for tonight, but it's certainly there. It's certainly implied, the idea of wisdom. What is wisdom?
Knowledge.
Sure. Knowledge applied would probably be the shortest answer we could possibly give to that question. How? Applied in what way? The right way, right?
Most beneficial way.
Yeah, the most beneficial way. I had a professor back at Freed-Hardeman tell me, it's kind of a wordy definition, but I kind of like it, that wisdom is being able to see the consequences of one's actions before partaking in those actions and then acting accordingly, right? If I realize that, okay, so I used to play baseball. I don't look like it, right? But I used to play baseball, and I used to go to the batting cage and swing and miss at a lot of balls that were pitched through the batting cage. Wisdom or knowledge says if I step in front of the pitching machine and get beamed repeatedly by the baseballs there, I'm going to get hurt, so I shouldn't do that. But it's not very wise if I just take that and say, okay, I'm going to step in front of that machine anyway, right? I have to react accordingly. And if you consider, especially the first 10 chapters of Proverbs, but really Proverbs as a whole, that's the whole point. You'll notice at the beginning of every major section of the first 10 chapters of Proverbs, it's an appeal. It's a parental appeal from a father to a son. And he's saying here, look, I'm going to tell you these things. I'm going to tell you the outcome of these things. I'm going to tell you what will happen if you participate in these things so you don't have to go through these things yourself. You don't have to deal with this yourself. And from what we know about Solomon, he dealt with quite a bit. He went through quite a bit. And so he's saying here, look, don't lean on your own understanding, and the implication is it's not going to do you any good. Yes?
Acknowledge him, the Hebrew term is Yad, and it means to be acquainted with. I met Chris about 15 minutes ago. I know about 2 things about you, maybe 3 from that brief conversation. I couldn't give much of a Bible on you, and how much can we acknowledge God? How it'll be determined by how well we are acquainted with him, and then that, of course, is the answer to our life of understanding. If we are better acquainted with our Father, we can act more like his children.
We just recently concluded at Hera a study of, not all of them, because there are quite a few, but some of the Hebrew names for God as presented in the Old Testament. And each of those names say something distinctive about God. The one that sticks out in my mind right now is Yahweh Ro'i, the Lord is my shepherd, right? Psalm 23. But each of those names, just even getting to know little bits and pieces, right? Little bits and pieces about God, tells us more and more and more about him. And when we learn more and more and more about him, we learn more and more and more about who he calls us to be. Right? It's not just some grand theology way up here that has no bearing on me. No, the more that I learn about God, the more that I understand about him, the more of an impact it should have on me, on my day-to-day life. This brings me to a point. We're going to stray away from this particular text for just a second. Verses 5 and 6. Every time I read this, I think back to events like September 11th. Most people in here, I assume, remember that at this point. Remember the events of that day. Were we in 5th grade? Yeah, we were in 5th grade. I was in 5th grade when that happened. I also think back to an event like Hurricane Katrina, which happened 8 years ago. 8-ish, 9-ish, right? Somebody can tell me I'm wrong later on, right? I've already admitted that I'm wrong from time to time, so.
Well, that's Kelsey.
Yeah. Ask Kelsey. Great. You'll notice when a tragedy like that happens, when something terrible happens, maybe it's even the ISIS threat now or something like that, whether it's something man-made or whether it's what we might call an act of God, right? There's going to be maybe a televangelist, maybe a scholar, maybe just somebody seemingly random that's pulled onto a cable news station or pulled onto your TV set in some way at the very least, that's going to tell you why that happened. That's going to tell you that it was God's judgment against the city of New Orleans. Did anyone else hear that during Hurricane Katrina? Goodness, I heard it constantly. That somehow God was using people to enact judgment against the United States. How can you possibly know that? How can you possibly understand that? Or another one, maybe a little bit more personal one. I've known of a few children, toddlers, that have contracted or developed, rather, cancer over the past few years. How can you possibly know why that happened? And yet people will claim, oh, this happened because of, oh, you don't understand. That's not for you to understand. You'll remember in John chapter 9, there's a blind man there, and Jesus' disciples, not just some random Jewish leaders, but Jesus' disciples there say, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin or the sin of his parents? And do we remember how Jesus responds? I can't hear muffled talking. How does Jesus respond? I think it's John chapter 9, verse 4. Yeah, the works of God might be made manifest in him. Number one, God knew, right? Jesus as God knows that. Number two, there's no way those disciples are going to know. There's not a chance those disciples on their own, without Jesus telling them, would have ever figured that out. You think about the book of Job. Book of Job struggles much with the same problem, right? Why do all of these bad things happen to Job? Why is Job gone from being, great, influential, at the very least wealthy, to in absolute misery after losing everything? Job struggles with it, and probably the worst thing that Job's friends do there is open their mouths and try and explain to him why he's going through this. You'll remember in Job chapter 2 and verse 13, they sit in silence with him for 7 days. That's the best thing they could have possibly done there because they don't know. And ultimately, that's how God responds, right? You can't possibly know this. You see, there are many situations where we have to rely on, in every situation we ought to rely on the Lord's understanding. Leaning on the Lord with all of our heart. And in some cases that's simply because there's no possible way we can explain those events. For us to assume that we can is nothing short of arrogance. For me to assume I know why some terrible tragedy has happened is nothing short of arrogance. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Verse 6, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. One thing that comes out implicitly through this section, and I think explicitly here, is that Solomon doesn't compartmentalize our lives. If we're not careful, we might think, well, I have to just trust in the Lord with all of my heart. I might just have to trust in the Lord with one particular part of my being, but Proverbs makes no distinction between those parts other than in name. My whole self in everything that I do. Let's read verses 7 and 8 together. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. We use a phrase sometimes. You ever known anyone that's just been full of himself? You ever been full of yourself before? I don't know what else you'd be full of, but even in day-to-day situations, I tend to think, if I'm not careful, that I've got this handled. That my approach to whatever situation I find myself in is best. I had reasons for keeping my Social Security card in my wallet. They were bad reasons. I had reasons for keeping my wallet in my car. They were bad reasons. I think on this particular occasion it was just because I was very tired. But we learn from time to time that sometimes our reasons for doing things aren't all that good. but trusting in the Lord. The Lord's not going to lead us down a path of destruction. He's not going to lead us to a dead end. Right? It says, you trust in the Lord, fear the Lord. And by the way, fear and trusting in the Lord are two very similar ideas within wisdom literature, two very similar ideas within Proverbs. Fearing the Lord, trusting the Lord, leads us down those right paths. Sometimes we get too full of ourselves. Sometimes we think we have it all together. I mentioned this at Hera last night, and so if it's a little bit redundant, I apologize. But I personally believe, and this is nothing more than an opinion, but at the root of every single individual sin is pride. Choosing my way over God's. Deciding that my way is somehow better than what God has called for me to do, right? And that's what sin is, choosing to do something else other than God's will. So he says, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Now, when he says it will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones, is he saying that fearing the Lord is going to make me perfectly well physically? No, there we go. That works. I might have to hold on to that. No. What's he talking about?
In our soul.
Okay, in our soul. Anything else?
Paul talked about the peace that passes understanding.
Sure.
When you have that kind of peace, there's a lot of bad juices, I think, that don't flow out of a lot of internal organs that could be flowing out otherwise.
If you ever worry so much about something in particular, has anyone ever worried to the point where it's made you physically ill? Yeah? Yeah, I went through a little bit of that in college. I did not like my cell phone in college. I actually decided after a certain point in college, I was just going to turn my phone off while I was in class because I wanted to be able to concentrate. But there's a certain peace that comes with following the Lord. There's a certain peace that comes with knowing that we're doing what we are supposed to do. Knowing that there is someone who understands why all of these things are happening, why bad things happen to good people. There's someone that's ultimately in control of all of this, and he's told me, you're going to live a particular way. There's something comforting about the fact that I don't have to figure all of this out by myself. I do think there might be a small physical element to it, similar to what we've already talked about, that living the way that the Lord has called me to live is going to lead to a better physical well-being than what it could otherwise. But ultimately, there's a peace that I have in serving the Lord that I would not have otherwise. What time do I have? I don't have a clock. I'm used to a clock on that back wall. 6:43. Neat. Okay. Let's read verses 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. This is the prosperity gospel, right? Not quite. Not quite. Just a brief aside on that. The idea that I can measure my spiritual faithfulness, by how well off I am doing physically is not just bad theology, it is nothing short of satanic. That's exactly what the devil would have you to believe. That's exactly what he wants for you to believe, that if you are doing well physically in this world, that if you have some sort of material wealth, if you have some sort of wealthy estate, then you're fine. Just keep doing what you've been doing. You don't need anything. Well, not quite. We're going to get to that. But first he says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. This is what the Israelites were called to do in Deuteronomy, weren't they? Give the first of everything you have. Give the best of everything you have. My dad taught me, and I suppose Brianna as well, at a fairly young age. I guess I can't speak for her entirely, but taught us at a very young age that if you want to, you've probably heard the cliche, if you want to see where a man's priorities are, see where he spends his time. If you want to see where a man's priorities are, see where he spends his money. Take a look at your pocketbook. See where your money is going. And if I can go off on an aside for just a second, seriously, within the next couple of weeks, take a look at your pocketbook. Double check where your money is going, where the fruits of your labor are going, what things are important to you, and maybe what things aren't quite as important. It's not just talking about money, although I think money and material things are the primary focus of these two verses. I think it's true with time as well. Where are you spending your time? I'm glad that you're here tonight. I don't think Brother Kessler let you know of the punishment that you were in for by sitting in on this class, but I'm glad that you're here. You've chosen to spend a little bit of time this evening studying, not only studying the Word of God, but studying with your church family. And I think there's something important in that. Spending time together. Spending a great deal of time together. Yes?
Also to the idea of Luke 6:38, give, and it shall be given unto you, and then whatsoever measure you need, it will be measured to you again. Or the idea of where he said, if you remember the one that got 5 and then he was given 10, the potential of our lives in his service may be determined by what we do today, that it measures you more tomorrow.
Sure. And, we can take that a couple of different directions. On the one hand, when we are blessed physically, it's nothing short of a blessing from the Lord. Right? When I do have some sense of material wealth, it comes from the Lord. At the same time, that's not why we give those first fruits. We don't give expecting something greater physically in return. Right? The Israelites weren't giving, they weren't tithing, they weren't giving the best of what they had in order to receive something even greater physically in return. No, they saw it as an act of worship. They see it as an act of devotion, trusting that God will provide for them. And I think it's much the same way here. It's not talking about God saying, I'm going to make you rich beyond measure if you'll just give a little bit to me. I don't have to be able to prove that biblically. I can prove that in my own life. The Bible proves it too, right? It's not just my own life. But we all understand that just because I give something in a collection tray doesn't mean that God's going to repay me tenfold physically later on. But it does mean He will provide for me. That devotion to the Lord. That giving to the Lord, giving the Lord the best of what I have, the first of what I have.
I was thinking of it in terms of open doors of opportunity. That we pray for open doors. Who gives those open doors? God would grant it to someone who has already maybe gone through some doors. And that principle, that with that kind of a father, what can we as his children do is to build a spiritual confidence.
And I think from Solomon's experience, it would be fair to say that it opens the right kind of doors. He's learned from opening those wrong doors that come from putting your money, your wealth, your effort, your time in wrong places.
That's not for us.
Oh, okay. I'm used to bells being for me, so if I do a small pause at during every bell, you'll have to forgive me. Barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. It's not just some sort of physical reciprocation. Yes, the Lord can and does bless us physically. But Jesus makes it pretty clear in the Sermon on the Mount, right, that he blesses everyone physically. What'd you have?
I was just going to say, it reminds me of the Beatitudes, those who hunger and thirst will be filled.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a special subset of blessings, if you want to call them that, reserved for Christians, those found in him. There's a whole long list of them we don't have the time to look at. It's found in Ephesians chapter 1. You'll see the phrase in him or in Christ repeatedly. And the whole chapter is about the blessings that are found in him. And so there is a way where Christians, where those that follow God, are particularly blessed.
There's a principle in Galatians Paul brings to bear that was really one that God set down for us in the first chapter of Genesis, that everything reproduces after its kind. So if we're putting our trust into God, that's going to reproduce in one way or another. We won't understand how it comes, but it'll come in one way or another. Eventually, God will not be mocked. What we sow, that's what we're going to reap. That's what Galatians teaches.
And there's a negative example of what happens when you do trust in physical things found, we tend to call it the entire book of Ecclesiastes. There's a very negative attitude towards trusting in physical things. Well, you die, and where does your money go? Maybe it goes to someone that you didn't intend for it to go, and he goes off and wastes it. What good did it do you? No, there's something else being talked about here. I think also, though, when we do talk about our physical blessings, there's a recognition that they ultimately come from the Lord. Right? That if there is any sort of reciprocity in verse 10, it's simply an understanding that the physical things we do have ultimately come from the Lord. All right, let's do one more stanza here, and then we'll break for snacks. Sugar, I suppose. Verses 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with... Nope, that's not it. Last two. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. How many parents do we have in here? Yeah? You ever discipline your kids? Some of you maybe disciplined them earlier today. Huh. I don't know that that's quite the discipline we're talking about here in these two verses. Alrighty. Does discipline always constitute punishment? No. Yeah. The one being disciplined might think so, right? I suppose they're extremely biased. No, discipline. Well, you'll notice discipline. One of the things that you see quite often in wisdom literature, in Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, is there's going to be parallelism, and it helps us understand these ideas. And discipline in the first part of verse 11 is paralleled with reproof. I don't always need to punish wrongdoing with retribution. God doesn't always punish wrongdoing with retribution. Of course, he ultimately will, right? That's what judgment is. But sometimes reproof comes in the form of a challenge. You've done wrong before. Stop doing what you've done. Maybe you don't even have to say that. And challenge someone to do better. Sometimes that's how retribution. That's how discipline works. Of course, sometimes it can involve punishment. Sometimes children need to be grounded, right? Sometimes children need to be put in timeout. I'd suggest that probably doesn't work if you've got like a 16 or 17-year-old. But I do want to suggest to you that when someone comes forward during the invitation, when someone has admitted that they have sinned, the last thing they need to be told, the last thing that needs to be done is have someone berate them for sinning. They recognize they're wrong. You'll notice in Acts chapter 2, when Peter's preaching there, he tells those that are gathered at Pentecost what they've done. But once they admit that they were wrong, once they say, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" which is an admission of guilt as much as it is anything, the berating stops. The reinforcement that they were somehow wrong stops. I also wonder if verses 9 and 10 are contrasted with verses 11 and 12. Sometimes the reason that maybe I'm not as well off, sometimes the reason that things aren't going quite the way I like is because it serves as reproof. Now, we have to be careful with that, right? I can never assume that the reason I'm in a given situation is because, oh, the Lord has caused me to be in this situation. He has dictated, you are going to be worse off because you stole a cookie, right? You're going to be worse off because you've committed some horrible, unspeakable sin. But I do think when we find ourselves in a position that we don't want to be in as Christians, when we find ourselves in a position in life, we wonder where, you wake up one morning and ask yourself, how have I gotten here? It ought to at least make you think, at least make you re-examine the things that you've done in this life. Sometimes after re-examining it, after re-examining those things that you've done in your life, you might realize, I don't know that I'm at fault. Sometimes you'll realize, no, I put myself here. I reckon it's sometime after 7:50 at this point. Is it? Probably. What time we got? 6:50, right? Not 7:50. Oh, okay. Let's take about a 15 to 20 minute break, and then we'll come back in here and finish up. And go get some sugar. Yay.